Welcome back to episode 4 of the Gray Files, where we explore the collision zones between technology, economics, data science, and humanity. I'm your host, Erika Barker, and today we're walking straight into a topic that might shake the very foundations of how societies might govern themselves in the future. Some folks call it Governance 4.0. Others might call it humanity's next leap forward, or the world's biggest overreach. However you slice it, there's no denying that a transformation in governance seems to be looming, fueled by advances in artificial intelligence, shifting power centers, and the global challenges piling up on our doorstep. Now, before we plunge into the main event, I like to paint you a small portrait of a group of ambitious young entrepreneurs and engineers who once huddled around battered desk in the late 1990s, coding the future of online payments. Names like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, David Sachs, and Reid Hoffman were simply bright-eyed dreamers back then, but a few short years and a lucrative sell later, their influence sprawled far beyond mere payment systems. Some launched spaceships, others nurtured social media empires, others dived into venture capital and think tanks. Along the way, they helped spawn a culture that reveres the founder hero, the visionary genius who sweeps aside old bureaucracies with grand, data driven ideas. It's in that swirl of ambition that we also find Curtis Yarvin, a voice tied to the Dark Enlightenment or Neo Reaction movement, a man who has proposed that democracy might be hopelessly flawed and maybe we'd be better off with a CEO sovereign at the helm of a more centralized society. Rumors and dinner party whispers have occasionally linked Yarvin's theories to certain corners of Silicon Valley's elite, fueling talk that the old dream of government by the people could be replaced by government by the best and brightest, or simply by those with the deepest pockets. In short, these new aristocrats of tech aren't just building gadgets and software, they may be rewriting the rules of governance itself. But that's enough of a teaser for now. Let's jump into the thick of it. As always, we'll keep our perspective wide, zooming out to a cosmic vantage whenever possible, so we can scrutinize the forces at work without getting lost in the daily noise. And that means it's time to begin part 1 of our deep dive. Part 1: The U.S. Democratic Republic Under Strain. In the United States, we're looking at a democratic republic that's showing real signs of fatigue. It's something you can sense in headlines about growing polarization, and rants about bureaucratic bloat, and think pieces about money's corrupting influence, and in the open cynicism many voters feel whenever election season rolls around. Scholars like Stephen Levitsky, who wrote How Democracies Die, warn that modern democracies don't always crash like a thunderbolt. More often, they decay from within. Politicians and party operatives keep the trappings of democracy, courts, elections, a free press, but they methodically undercut its spirit, stacking oversight bodies with loyalists, crippling independent agencies, or using the media environment to bury dissent. If you add advanced data analytics or social media manipulation into that toolbox, you've got a recipe for stealth authoritarianism, an era where incumbents quietly maintain power while the public sees only a theatrical veneer of business as usual. It's easy to blame politicians for the gridlock, but technology itself is also reconfiguring where power resides. AI driven systems can crunch data in ways human legislators simply can't. That might sound efficient. I mean, who wouldn't want a well honed algorithm weeding out waste or suggesting nuanced policy fixes? But if these AI systems remain in the hands of private corporations or an elite group of developers, we could wake up to find that real power has shifted into a black box. The public might still vote, but if the actionable policy recommendations come from a hidden layer of code, how genuinely free is that vote? Some local governments, sensing the pressure, have tried co governance experiments where community reps and public officials collaboratively shape policy. It's a partial antidote to the feeling of top down rule that has alienated so many. Advocates hope that involving citizens at every step, brainstorming, drafting proposals, decision making, might reignite trust and ward off the slow drift into a hollowed out democracy. Nobody claims it's easy, but it's one of the more hopeful developments in a climate brimming with cynicism. Currently, right now, as of 2025, the US government is in the process of recalibrating powers to be more centralized at the executive level in an effort to expedite innovation and not lose its superpower status to other nations. It's an evolution from our current democratic republic to an illiberal democracy, or as some deem as soft authoritarianism. What it evolves to from there is more than likely something revolving around a technocratic meritocracy. Part 2: Techno-Feudalism and the Dark Enlightenment Debate. If you listen to episode 1 and 2 of our podcast, I talked about some sobering numbers that should alarm you. One particular is the velocity of money in the US, or an indicator of how well money is circulating in the real economy. This metric has declined by nearly 38% since July 1997. That's an annual rate of about 1.7% per year. Meanwhile, the proportion of middle class households has dropped significantly over the past few decades, not just in the United States, but across much of the developed world. These trends aren't just about wallet sizes or bank accounts. They are canaries in the coal mine for a possible shift or collapse in governance itself. If the economic backbone of democracy weakens, that being the middle class, and capital piles up in fewer hands, then elites, particularly those in Silicon Valley, may or are seeing an opportunity or feel compelled to usher in new forms of rule. That's where our story of techno feudalism begins. Imagine stepping into a neon lit cityscape where glass towers loom overhead, each brimming with servers and biometric scanners. You look around, and it's not kings or presidents in charge, it's tech entrepreneurs, the ones we used to call disruptors. Critics have a name for this emerging power structure: techno feudalism. It sounds dramatic, maybe even dystopian, but there's a growing sense that while our democratic institutions squabble, a new breed of aristocrat is quietly seizing the throne. Let's rewind. Feudalism once meant lords with swords and peasants in the field and a social order dictated by land ownership. Today, the argument goes we're seeing an updated version: lords of data and capital instead of dukes and knights. Figures like Steve Bannon warn that certain ultra wealthy elites, including some minted by the PayPal mafia era, are positioning themselves like monarchs. They might speak the language of innovation and progress, but at heart, they're carving out personal domains where their algorithms and not elected officials decide everything from civic planning to social policy. Picture the typical storyline. Democracy gets tangled in partisan bickering, misinformation floods social media, and the average voter becomes jaded. Cue the tech titan stepping in with an AI based solution that promises to outthink human bureaucracy. That's the techno feudalist script. Public institutions recede, replaced by powerful private platforms that shape policy by default. It's not that you wake up one morning and see a coronation. There's no crowning in a cathedral. Rather, you blink and realize your local government relies on proprietary data streams controlled by a handful of moguls. And once that dependence is locked in, who really wields power? Now meet Curtis Yarvin, a figure whose ideas have ignited countless late night debates. He's associated with the Dark Enlightenment, or Neo Reaction, a movement that flat out questions the efficiency and morality of liberal democracy. His core message: democracy is messy, inefficient, and fundamentally broken. A single CEO sovereign free from congressional gridlock or populist fluctuations could run things more effectively. Think of it like taking the move fast and break things ethos of Silicon Valley and applying it to government itself. So, why does that resonate in certain corners of tech? Because there's a frustration with how long it takes for big public projects to break ground. Politicians stall, lobbyists meddle, and the final product often feels watered down. Yarvin's prescription is to cut through the red tape, centralize power in a high IQ leader, and let them coordinate resources with the precision of a startup founder. In that sense, it's not about bloodlines or dynasties, but about technocratic skill. The person who can code, strategize, and scale solutions to national problems the way a CEO scales a company. Now, here is where the discussion hits a nerve. A data driven government run by a single visionary might achieve feats that democracy struggles to accomplish, like overhauling infrastructure in record time or pushing radical breakthroughs in healthcare. But critics see a slippery slope toward an autocracy of coders. You might trade the chaos of democracy for a crisp, centralized directive that pumps out swift policy changes. Yet, once you lose checks and balances, you risk entrenching power in the hands of a few, and there's no easy off ramp if they decide to wield that power poorly. Defenders of democracy argue that government isn't a widget factory. It's an arena where moral values, cultural traditions, and minority rights get hammered into law. In a top down structure, even a brilliant CEO sovereign might neglect or override those intangibles that don't fit neatly into a data model. Are we okay letting algorithms decide, for instance, who should receive more police surveillance or which communities merit urban renewal? Without broad public input, that approach could deepen inequalities or pave over local identities. So, why call it feudalism? Well, in medieval Europe, peasants labored on land owned by lords who provided protection in return. Fast forward to today's tech realm, and some see a parallel. We rely on social media platforms, ride sharing apps, and search engines that effectively own the digital land. We sign user agreements that read like feudal contracts, ceding personal data for the protection of convenience or connectivity. Meanwhile, the platform owners accumulate wealth at a staggering pace, reinvesting it in new ventures, shaping markets, and even funding political campaigns. The fear is that over time, a handful of moguls become the gatekeepers of public life, an aristocracy with no real obligation to the public. Sure, they can be philanthropic. They might fund scholarships or planetary exploration, but in a pseudo feudal structure, the power dynamic remains top heavy. If you're just a user, you can't easily hold them accountable the way you might an elected official. There is no vote to cast, only terms of service to accept or reject. Curtis Yarvin's critics aren't merely outraged by the concept, they raise practical concerns. Let's assume you do install a CEO sovereign, someone like a genius founder who built a $1 trillion tech empire. What if that sovereign becomes erratic? Human psychology is precarious. A single meltdown, a compromise, a blackmail, or even a well timed smear campaign could destabilize the entire system. Traditional democracies, for all their flaws, disperse authority so that no single meltdown can topple the entire structure. Moreover, there's the succession problem. One day, the visionary might retire or die. Then, who steps in? Another handpicked genius? A relative? Or does a subordinate seize power in a coup? History is full of monarchies and dictatorships that flourish under a charismatic leader only to collapse when that leader is gone. If democracy's big advantage is an established process for transferring power peacefully, the Dark Enlightenment's approach looks fragile by comparison. At the heart of this debate is a tension older than democracy itself. Is governance about efficiency or about participation? Yarvin and other neo reactionaries seem to lean heavily on the efficiency side, trusting an elite mind to produce better, faster outcomes. Democratic theorists fire back that citizen engagement isn't an inefficiency, it's the very essence of legitimate governance. If people lose their collective voice, do we even call it government by the people? Proponents of techno-feudalism might say, look, you vote with your usage. If you don't like a platform, stop using it. But that's a shallow form of choice if your entire livelihood, your job, your community, your social connections depend on these digital infrastructures. When leaving the system isn't realistically an option, you're more serf than citizen. So, are we headed for a future of CEO sovereigns and aristocratic founder heroes? Or will democracy adapt in time to handle the new challenges of technology? It's not just a hypothetical question. Billionaires already float ideas about building private enclaves, launching off world colonies, or reorganizing existing governments around data driven principles. Some localities rely so heavily on private tech solutions that the line between public and private decision making blurs. On the flip side, the pushback is also growing. You see activists demanding better antitrust enforcement, journalists exposing algorithmic biases, and grassroots movements calling for open source governance tools. The argument is that technology should empower democracy, not dismantle it. And the outcome might depend on whether the public can stay engaged enough to shape these emerging systems before they solidify into modern day fiefdoms. In short, techno-feudalism and the Dark Enlightenment present a stark vision, one where a data-savvy elite runs society like an enterprise, unbothered by the slow churn of traditional politics. Its supporters see it as a rational upgrade, a chance to escape the slog and inefficiencies of democracy. Opponents see it as a gateway to tyranny, lacking the checks that prevent power from pooling in a single pair of hands. Which path will we choose? Maybe there's a middle way, one that harnesses technology without surrendering democratic ideals. Or maybe, as some fear, the tide of wealth and data has already turned, pulling us toward a future we can't easily reverse. Either way, the debate is no longer niche. It's creeping into mainstream conversations. And who controls our digital platforms? Who sets the rules? And how power flows in an increasingly algorithmic world. Part 3: The WEF's Multi Stakeholder Model, Governance 4.0. While some envision a world run by data savvy monarchs, another school of thought, often associated with the World Economic Forum or WEF, emerges as a kinder, gentler approach. Dubbed Governance 4.0, a multi stakeholder governance. It calls for governments, corporations, philanthropic organizations, NGOs, and community groups to unite around one table, pooling resources and ideas to tackle border defying crises like climate change, pandemics, economic disparities. At first glance, it sounds like a visionary collaboration. Top minds from every sector armed with unlimited funding and global reach, all geared toward the common good. Yet, this model sparks controversy precisely because of its promise. Yes, existential problems demand swift, well financed, and expert driven solutions. But skeptics worry such gatherings become exclusive clubs where powerful interests dominate the conversation. Ordinary citizens and smaller organizations might find themselves sidelined by corporate juggernauts, boasting armies of lobbyists, data scientists, and well polished white papers. This isn't just a matter of simple power imbalance. The WEF, often referred to as the Davos crowd, brands itself as the ultimate convening authority, bridging the gap between public and private to resolve humanity's biggest challenges. But who elected these corporate leaders or billionaire philanthropists to make decisions on climate policy or digital governance? Critics see a new paternalism where the ultra wealthy play benevolent overseers, inviting the world's underfunded communities to the table but quietly redirecting the final outcomes. In many cases, these philanthropic or corporate titans also have a vested interest, like owning patents on emerging technologies or shaping regulations that benefit their industries. Moreover, accountability becomes fuzzy. Traditional governments are, at least in theory, answerable to voters or subject to checks and balances. A multi stakeholder framework, by contrast, might sidestep these mechanisms. Yes, there may be formal committees or public dialogues, but if the major funds come from private pockets, who really calls the shots? And if things go wrong, say a data driven pandemic response plan fails or a climate initiative disadvantages certain local communities, can citizens sue a board of NGOs or philanthropic entity? The chain of responsibility gets tangled, raising fears that multi stakeholder governance could effectively privatize essential decision making processes. Even so, it's not all doom and gloom. Proponents argue that national governments alone often fail to address global crises. Electoral cycles and partisan standoffs can stall meaningful action. The WEF approach, in theory, marshals the best minds, the deepest pockets, and the broadest networks, aiming for quick, innovative fixes. They point to global vaccination campaigns or environmental pledges as examples where cross sector alliances can act faster than sluggish treaty negotiations. And sometimes they succeed, particularly where technology and scalable solutions align with strong corporate incentives. Yet the fundamental question remains: does multi stakeholderism represent an evolution of democracy into a flexible, global form, one capable of agile responses to planetary threats? Or is it a slippery slope toward corporate feudalism, just wearing a friendlier face? Grassroots activists and civil society groups often can't match the resources of giant transnationals. That disparity risks shaping policy outcomes that favor large commercial interests or philanthropic visions over local realities. A well intended program to upgrade farming technology, for instance, might inadvertently displace traditional methods or erode cultural practices if local communities aren't meaningfully included in the final say. Ultimately, Governance 4.0 is neither a guaranteed utopia nor a guaranteed con. It's a stage where the lines between public service and private interest blur, and where glossy brochures touting one Earth, one future can mask hidden power plays. The WEF's multi stakeholder model might offer a way to bypass gridlock and channel resources effectively, but it also raises fundamental questions about transparency representation and who holds the reins in our rapidly changing world. As more crises mount, like environmental, health related, economic, this approach will likely gain more traction for better or worse. Whether it becomes a genuine force for collaborative good or a Trojan horse for entrenched elites depends on how and by whom these multi stakeholder platforms are ultimately governed. Part 4: Historical, Cross Cultural, and Philosophical Underpinnings. If all this talk of monarchy, technocracy, or multi stakeholder rule sounds wildly new, a quick look at history shows parallels and cautionary tales. Democratic transitions have happened before, and they often meet fierce resistance from elites. Monarchies gave way to constitutional republics in Europe under the banner of Enlightenment values. Ancient Athens managed direct democracy because its population was small enough to gather in one place. Indigenous cultures have practiced consensus based governance, which thrives on local knowledge and communal identity. The medieval Hanseatic League, meanwhile, was a loose coalition of merchant cities that found prosperity through decentralized cooperation until shifting power dynamics toward apart. Thinkers such as Robert Dahl remind us that democracy isn't just about outputs, laws, policies, budgets. It's also about the moral and symbolic worth of people governing themselves. When technology speeds things up or places decisions in the hands of an algorithm, do we lose the sense that we, the public, actually own the outcomes? On the AI ethics front, scholars like Nick Bostrom warn of alignment risk. If an AI runs amok with the wrong objectives, or if it's compromised by biased data, democracy could be replaced by a well meaning but misguided engine that inadvertently cements inequality. Transparency is essential. If we don't know how the algorithms are making decisions, we can't challenge or reform them. Part 5: America's Constitutional and International Context. The United States Constitution didn't anticipate quantum computing or global internet networks. It partitions powers among branches: executive, legislative, judicial, but none of these branches is an AI. Could we incorporate advanced data driven policymaking within that existing framework, or would we need new constitutional amendments? If an AI recommendation conflicts with Congress, who prevails? And if we do modify the Constitution, how do we ensure it reflects the will of the people? Legal liability is another tangle. If an AI driven system misallocates resources, or if a policing algorithm errs and violates civil rights, do we sue the developers? The agencies that implemented it? The stewards who supervised it? The labyrinth grows more complex when you consider that corporate interest and foreign governments might try to sabotage or exploit American AI systems, viewing them as strategic vulnerabilities. Speaking of foreign relations, imagine a U.S. governance structure that runs on real time data. How do nations like China or Russia react? Do they see it as an existential threat, prompting a cyber race to keep up or tear it down? Do we risk a new arms race, but with lines of code instead of missiles? Part 6: The Integrative Equilibrium System. Amid this swirl, there's many proposals and even hybrids. And that brings me to IES. It's actually my own blueprint for a meritocratic AI assisted governance architecture that aims to preserve democratic ideals while tackling the inefficiencies rotting our current system. I developed this by setting 4 different LLMs together with a task list of solving all the current problems we face in American democracy along with other world powers, and to create an efficient system as if they were aliens from a more advanced civilization, with the goal to maintain peace, happiness, prosperity, and freedom among the masses of the population. The 4 LLMs would argue via a Python script I created until they came to a 100% consensus on the best, most optimal system for mankind. So think of it as a carefully balanced 3 part mechanism, each designed to check and inform the others. Picture a governance system that harnesses cutting edge AI for the real time policy insights, but still places human values and public accountability front and center. That, in essence, is the Integrative Equilibrium System, or IES. While the name might sound futuristic, its core mission is straightforward: use robust, transparent technology to enhance, not replace, the collective wisdom that underpins a healthy society. Pillar 1: Quantum AI Advisory Core, the data driven brain. At the heart of IES sits the Quantum AI Advisory Core. Unlike traditional government processes covered in red tape, this open source policy lab ingests vast, constantly updating data streams. Everything from economic indicators and public health statistics to environmental metrics. With quantum level computing power, or similarly advanced next gen architecture, it can crunch scenarios, forecast outcomes, and propose solutions in near real time. But here's a key distinction: the system's algorithms are publicly audible. Think of the core as a civic utility. Coders, researchers, and civic watchdogs can all peek under the hood, running simulations to ensure no hidden lines of code skew results. This transparency fosters trust because anyone, be they a local journalist or an international think tank, can verify the integrity of the logic and data sets. The core also maintains a historical ledger of policy simulations, enabling society to learn from past successes and failures. So, why does it matter? By continuously scanning social, economic, and environmental indicators, this AI can preempt a crisis, spotting, for instance, a housing bubble long before it bursts, or detecting a regional healthcare bottleneck before it hits catastrophe. Instead of waiting on quarterly reports or year long inquiries, policymakers and citizens alike get real time alerts and nuanced, data backed suggestions. Pillar 2: The Circle of Stewards: Human Oversight and Ethical Filters. No matter how sophisticated the AI, IES refuses to let it operate as an unbridled force. Enter the Circle of Stewards, a rotating council of experts that serves as the system's ethical and cultural compass. Composed of economists, ethicists, technologists, sociologists, and sometimes religious or cultural leaders, this council isn't static. Terms are limited so that no single group cements a permanent foothold. Transparent conflict of interest rules further ensure that corporate lobbyists or partisan insiders can't quietly co opt the process. When the AI proposes a new policy, say an environmental regulation to curb water usage or an adjustment to capital gains taxes, the stewards scrutinize it. They ask, does this conflict with civil rights? Could it inadvertently disadvantage a vulnerable community? Is it consistent with broader cultural values? They can veto, refine, or greenlight AI suggestions, bridging cold data with livid human experiences. The key is balance. Harness the efficiency of algorithms without discarding ethical nuance. Pillar 3: Liquid Merit Forums: Inclusive yet informed civic participation. A hallmark of IES is structured public engagement through liquid merit forums. Traditional democracy often swings between populism and elitism. IES aims for a middle path. Everyone can participate, but those who demonstrate particular knowledge or community contributions earn weighted credibility, not unlike how certain online forums grant higher privileges to reputable contributors. For instance, a local teacher who's taken extra courses in environmental science might have a slightly stronger vote on a climate initiative. A nurse active in community clinics might be more influential in healthcare deliberations. Crucially, these merits are earned through verifiable civic or educational achievements, not purchased by wealth or connections. This design deters misinformation campaigns or mob rule while still keeping the door open for an earnest citizen willing to engage. And if you're worried that your voice doesn't count, you can up your influence by learning, volunteering, or passing public service modules. Pillar 4: Proactive economic safeguards, monitoring markets and universal basic assets. Too often, governments react to financial crisis only after they started wreaking havoc. IES flips the script. Its AI consciously watches for monopolistic behaviors, asset bubbles, and speculative frenzies in real time. If warning flags spike, like sudden housing inflation or over leveraged corporate debt, the system can propose targeted tax hikes, antitrust actions, or capital controls before meltdown unfolds. Then there's the bedrock principle of universal basic assets, or UBA. Unlike a one size fits all income stipend, UBA guarantees everyone access to essential goods, housing, healthcare, education, utilities. This safety net aims to prevent poverty traps without smothering competitive markets. By ensuring no one falls below a decent standard of living, society unlocks more talent, innovation, and genuine competition rather than letting wealth pull at the top. Pillar 5: Data integrity and auditing, preventing the capture of AI. The Achilles heel of any AI led system is data bias. If corporations, political interest, or flawed historical datasets slant the inputs, outcomes can be catastrophic. Hence, IES mandates regular, open data audits by independent watchdogs and academics. Citizen data stewards can also file challenges, triggering public investigations into suspicious patterns. This multi pronged approach helps ensure no private entity stealthily alters training data or sneak biased algorithms into the pipeline. By weaving together an AI driven policy core, human checked ethical scrutiny, merit based public engagement, and proactive economic safeguards, the integrative equilibrium system aspires to do more than just speed up governance. It aims to redeem democracy in an era of complexity, where decisions must be fast yet fair, data driven yet deeply human, and globally mindful yet locally anchored. Does it demand new institutions, constitutional adjustments, and cultural shift toward transparency? Absolutely. But for policymakers seeking a blueprint that's both visionary and grounded in workable checks, IES offers a compelling invitation to reimagine how power can flow responsibly in the 21st century. Now, the question is, how does IES stack up against the other models? And in an ideal world, I would have a complicated simulation system that would test this over 500 years of historical data from society shifts to human psychology. But instead, we will revisit our Python script with 4 LLMs and have them debate it out until they reach a 100% consensus. So, how does it actually fare when measured against the leading alternatives? Well, first, let's talk about the technocratic proposals of Yarvin and other neo authoritarians. Curtis Yarvin's Dark Enlightenment philosophy promotes a CEO sovereign for top down efficiency with minimal public intrusion. In contrast, IES rejects the notion that a lone genius or a small council should rule unchecked. The IES circle of stewards might share certain technocratic traits, like domain specific expertise, but it's balanced by a liquid merit forum that ensures broad public input. Where Yarvin's model counts on a single figure's intellectual prowess, IES disperses decision making across AI driven analytics, rotating expert councils, and actively engaged citizens, reducing the risk of personality driven autocracy. So, what was the verdict? Well, the four LLMs came to an agreement. IES stands for accountability and distributed authority, guarding against a single point failure while still leveraging technocratic rigor. And now that brings us to the stakeholder governance model, or governance 4.0 from the World Economic Forums. Multi stakeholder efforts aim to unite corporations, governments, and civil society for swift responses to global crisis. In theory, this resembles IES in its push for diverse input, but the WEF model can tilt the playing field toward wealthy sponsors and influential NGOs. By contrast, IES builds in transparent, auditable AI and structured public participation via a weighted citizen participation to curb disproportionate influence. Instead of letting the largest funder steer the agenda, the system's open source data protocols and rotating stewards hamper backroom deal making. So, what was the verdict? Both aspire to collaborative governance, but IES imposes more formal checks to prevent deep pocketed actors from hijacking policy. Now, this is one we really haven't talked too much about. China's top down socialism with Chinese characteristics fuses authoritarian party control with heavy investment in AI driven oversight. It delivers swift policy execution, but often lacks transparency and legal recourse for those negatively affected. IES departs from this heavily centralized power structure by embedding human rights protections, ethical committees, and open source audits at its core. While China's model can pivot fast, it can also steamroll dissent. IES attempts to harness data for speed without sacrificing pluralism or independent oversight. So, what was the verdict? IES outperforms on transparency, personal freedoms, and decentralized checks, even if it moves more slowly than China's top down juggernaut. Now, how about Singapore's smart nation? Singapore's governance balances a strong central government with efficient public services, often employing data analysis to optimize policy. It's sometimes seen as a benevolent technocracy, culturally cohesive, yet top down in execution. IES echoes Singapore and its commitment to measurable outcomes and pragmatic solutions, but diverges on the degree of citizen empowerment. Where Singapore's paternalistic streak can sideline robust opposition, IES formalizes liquid merit forums to incorporate a wider spectrum of expertise and grassroots voices. So, what was the verdict? Both prize efficiency and data driven policy, but IES leans further into open participation, seeking to expand legitimacy beyond traditional government knows best norms. And how about America's Democratic Republic, our current system? Well, the United States prides itself on a constitutional structure with checks and balances, shaped by free elections and representative institutions. Yet modern governance faces polarization, lobbying clout, and legislative gridlock. IES proposes adding AI driven transparency and weighted citizen participation as new levers for real time accountability, bridging gaps that allow money and partisanship to dominate. Unlike a pure rework of American democracy, IES coexists with existing frameworks but upgrades them with dynamic feedback loops, continuous policy revision, and a baseline of universal basic assets. So, what was the verdict? Rather than discarding the founders' ideals, IES attempts to bolster them with advanced analytics, systematic oversight, and structured citizen engagement, guarding against special interest capture without discarding core democratic principles. So, what is the final takeaway? Well, when stress tested against these governance models, when we did this 4 LLM simulated stress test, and I did this over and over and over again for 50 times, IES seeks a middle ground. It blends the quick response promise of technocracy with the moral legitimacy of democracy, the global collaboration of stakeholder governance with robust citizen checks, and the efficiency of smart nations while insulating itself from authoritarian excess. Its success, however, hinges on whether society can implement a system that uses AI without ceding human agency, and whether we can collectively build the trust and transparency needed to keep the system honest. In other words, IES stands or falls by our willingness to demand accountability from both algorithms and elites. Part 7: Implementation and Potential Concerns. The shift to something like IES can't happen overnight. Think of it as a three-phase rollout. First, you test it in small jurisdictions, special economic zones like smart cities, or pilot programs in progressive states, letting AI handle budget proposals and letting citizens experience weighted voting for certain local ordinances. You track the results meticulously. Does corruption dip? Does infrastructure improve? Does public satisfaction inch up? If the pilots flourish, you scale up, maybe by mid century. The AI gets a seat at the federal legislative table, advisory at first, but with increasing authority as trust grows. Real time law adaptation might replace the old procedure of letting flawed regulations linger for decades. But the latter half of the century, if it all holds water, we could see a world where the quantum core, human stewards, and newly educated, engaged citizenry steer the ship together. But so many hazards line the road. For one, entrenched power centers, entire political parties, corporate lobbies, media conglomerates won't be too thrilled to see their clout undermined by an open source platform. They could sabotage or co opt the system early on. Public skepticism is another barrier. Ask folks if they want AI to run the government, and many bristle at the notion. They might worry about job displacement or fear a creeping sense of alienation, as though democracy is no longer theirs to shape. There's also the matter of privacy. A data driven system needs vast amounts of personal and societal information to function effectively. If the public lacks trust in how that data is collected or used, the system could be dead on arrival. For other models, some have suggested that to prevent any single point of corruption, we might run multiple AI engines side by side, each coded by different teams, cross verifying each other's outputs. Others propose embedding immutable moral constraints in the code, though critics wonder who gets to define those morals. Could they be updated if society's views shift on, say, like immigration or climate policy? On the political spectrum, you get pushback from both the left and right. Conservatives might champion the efficiency angle but recoil at the notion of universal basic assets, seeing it as creeping socialism. Liberals might love the transparency and social safety net components, but worry weighted voting is elitist or that data hungry AI infringes on civil liberties. Bridging these divides, of course, calls for robust public debate, an extended national conversation about whether the status quo is so broken that we're willing to try something radically different. Part 8: A New Era of Enlightenment or Just Another Fantasy. No governance model is perfect. Competitive authoritarianism might keep up appearances, but it snuffs out genuine opposition. The WEF's multi stakeholder approach could drown out grassroots voices in a sea of corporate money. The dark Enlightenment solutions might deliver swift results, but at the cost of personal freedoms and moral checks. Traditional democracy? It's been a remarkable experiment, yet it's buckling under modern strains like hyperpartisanship, technological disruption, and mind boggling levels of wealth inequality. IES stands among these contenders, promising to marry the best of AI driven efficiency with the moral weight of expert and citizen oversight. It dares to claim we can adapt in real time, correct laws that fail, and reallocate resources when crises arise. We can keep corruption at bay through open source transparency. Is it a moonshot? Absolutely. But in an age where we're dealing with climate emergencies, global pandemics, and potential off world colonization, maybe a moonshot is exactly what we need. To truly evaluate whether this blueprint might work, we must do more than read white papers or hold think tank seminars. We need actual pilot projects, ongoing peer review, constant audits, and an informed public that can press stop if the system veers off the rails. Scholars like Eleanor Ostrom have shown us that communities can self govern resources when the right structures are in place. Nick Bostrom has warned that super intelligent systems carry existential risk. In the book, Why Nations Fail, highlight the need for inclusive institutions. All these insights feed into what might become the biggest reimagining of governance in centuries. Meanwhile, the cosmic vantage remains, reminding us that on a planetary scale, we can't afford to keep bumping along with outdated frameworks. The old divides are still here: right versus left, public versus private. But technology and a global crisis are cracking those divides wide open. The question is whether we'll watch passively as power shifts to billionaire tech lords or creeping autocrats, or whether we'll muster the ambition to try something new, untested, and possibly revolutionary. I'm Erika Barker, and this has been episode 4 of The Gray Files. If you're feeling overwhelmed, that's normal. Nobody said rethinking an entire system of government would be light reading or easy listening. But I'm not here to give you tidy answers. I'm here to plant the seeds of a deeper conversation because the fact is, no one can predict the future, but we can shape it if we remain informed, critical, and imaginative. Whether you're a fan of multi stakeholder summits, a believer in direct democracy, a curious onlooker to the dark enlightenment, or someone who sees hope in something like IES, your voice is part of the tapestry. And by the way, if you are curious about seeing charts and graphs and statistical data science analysis on these subjects we are talking about in the podcast, you can visit my website at erikabarker.ai. That's ERIKA, B as in Bravo, ARKER.ai. So stay tuned for more. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, in a world that's changing at warp speed, the act of paying attention is an act of power. Be safe, be curious, and I will catch you next time on The Gray Files.